So the resurrection proved that our guilt is no match for God's grace. We don't have to let guilt change our faith anymore. Instead, we get to let grace change our guilt. Talking about God's grace is one thing, but experiencing it is something else entirely different. And that's why we have small groups. Small group is the safest place for you to discover this alongside your friends and your youth leaders. Your youth leaders, they've encountered grace and they will pass that same grace on to you. That's what the resurrected Jesus demonstrated in Peter's life. And that's why Peter's afterlife was so powerful. While he was still on earth, because of the resurrection, Peter realized that grace is greater than guilt. And because of Easter, you can realize it as well. So let me ask you a question. Do you remember the last time that you felt guilty? When we feel guilty, we get really good at hiding. If we believe in God, chances are good that our guilt causes us to hide from Him too. We know God knows what we did is wrong, so we back away from our relationship with Him. We can't actually run away from God, so we just start to make Him less and less a part of our lives. No matter what it looks like for you, we all tend to let our guilt get in the way of our faith. Now, thankfully, we're not the first people to have these kind of experiences with guilt. The Bible provides plenty of examples that we can learn from. We've been in a series called Afterlife. We've looked at people who physically saw Jesus after the resurrection. That includes a guy named Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends and a key leader during the early days of the church. But Peter had some run-ins with guilt and shame like we do sometimes. When Jesus was arrested, Peter literally cut off a guy's ear to defend Jesus. Then just hours later, when Jesus was given a sketchy, bogus trial, Peter stood nearby and he lied 3 separate times about his connection to Jesus. He denied even knowing Jesus. Even worse, before any of this happened, Jesus actually told Peter that he would do exactly that he would deny being connected to Jesus, and he still did it anyway. Jesus was arrested, tried, and nailed to a Roman cross, and the last thing Peter did was deny even knowing Him. But like we've talked about in the series, Jesus' death wasn't the end of the story. Easter happens, right? The tomb is empty and Jesus is alive. To Peter, it's possible that the resurrection was a reminder of the guilt that he felt on the night Jesus died. A few days later, Jesus was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter was on a boat with the other disciples, and he saw Jesus resurrected. And so they went to the shore. Jesus made them breakfast, and he brought up the thing that was no doubt weighing on Peter's mind. John 21:15-17 says, "When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' 'Yes, Lord,' he said. 'You know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my lambs.' Again, Jesus said, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' He answered, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Take care of my sheep.' The third time he said to him, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said, 'Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my sheep.'" In other words, for every time that Peter denied knowing Jesus, Jesus gives Peter another chance. And in giving him a chance, Peter knows he is loved and forgiven. As humiliating and terrible as it was for Peter to deny Jesus, here was a chance to make it right. And even though Peter may have given up on himself, Jesus hadn't given up on Peter. Peter could have given into his guilt and gone into hiding, but that isn't what Jesus wanted for Peter. Peter knew Jesus had been killed, and he saw Jesus after he came back to life. This proved to Peter that Jesus was capable of offering him the grace he needed to forgive himself. The resurrection proved that guilt didn't have to destroy Peter's faith. Instead, grace could destroy his guilt and fuel his faith. Because of the resurrection, Peter realized that grace was greater than guilt. If you're ready for something new, I want to give you a couple of steps that you can start taking now. Step 1, get real about where you feel guilt. This can be really tough, especially if you've hidden something so deep that you feel numb to it. But think about where you feel lingering guilt right now. Be honest with yourself about it. Acknowledge it, talk about it, or even put it down in a note on your phone. Just get honest. And then step 2, remember that guilt is no match for God's grace. Ask God to remind you that He is with you and for you even on those days. Ask Him to cover your guilt with the overwhelming reality of His grace. Listen, Easter matters for a lot of reasons. It shows us how big God's love is, what exactly God is like, and how God is more powerful than anything, including death. But Easter also shows us that Jesus is bigger than our guilt. And if Jesus gives us grace, it's ours for the taking. So when you feel those old guilt feelings kick in, ask God to give you a new reaction. Step 3, keep showing up and speaking up. Keep showing up and speaking up. Do the opposite of what guilt may have guided you to do in the past. Instead of hiding, show up to youth ministry, show up at church gatherings, show up to the hangout with your friends, show up to the dinner table with your family. After the resurrection, Peter didn't hide from Jesus. It would have been easier to, but he didn't do it. And like Peter, let's keep showing up. The resurrection proved that our guilt is no in no comparison to God's grace. We don't have to let guilt change our faith anymore. Instead, we get to let grace change our guilt. Talking about grace is one thing, but experiencing it is something else entirely.